In this session, we have a fantastic lineup of sort of people coming from mixed perspectives and places of work. And we're really focusing on the infrastructural elements needed to make open research work. So what was quite interesting in our preliminary discussions was that there was some sense that, open publications and the models, which we heard about in the first session, far from solved, obviously, but underway. And we kind of started gravitating to the space of open data that felt like a place where we could all really, really align without a great deal of conflict and look at, how can we really meaningfully accelerate through collaboration, or where do our perspectives or what we think has to happen next differ? So I don't really want to hear myself talk. We're going to focus on how we make that happen. And our panelists quickly are David Sweeney, the Executive Chair of Research England, UKRI, Lynn Camerlin, Professor of Structural Biology, Uppsala University, Curtis Brundy, AUL for Scholarly Communications and Collections at Iowa State University Library, and Catherine Sharples, Senior Director for Open Access at Wiley. So I think we'll go in order. We have no slides in this section other than the one Howard has up. So maybe we can look at our speakers. Everyone will just sort of say something in order to kick it off, and then we'll have open conversation Q&A with the panelists. David, would you like to begin?
Yes, I'm delighted to be here. And can I say it's a privilege to be on a panel with such eminent people. Lynn, I do hang on your every tweet, I've got to say. Thanks. And it was also a pleasure to listen to the earlier session. I come as, in fact, executive chair of the biggest single funding council in the UK, but my early career involved responsibility for 10 years for University Library and in my university then for determining the budget for the library. So I've been in most of the positions. We're also unique, I think, in the UK in our overall organization, we fund both research projects, and in my bit of the organization, we fund the underpinning research that the government commissions the university to do. So we give a substantial amount of money to universities, which is not targeted at any particular purpose in research, but will typically be used about 10% of it probably for subscription charges. But I'm also responsible in my umbrella organization for the project funding, and I'll talk about that, where we do things differently in the UK, and I think it works for us. I guess you've had that from the Brits a bit. Just before that, can I say, I've listened to the previous conversation. I think where we are now is that we cannot deliver what everyone wants because of the complexities of the system, the different models, which I thought were brilliantly described in the previous session. And I think a focus for infrastructure is on deciding what is absolutely necessary, and in challenging ourselves about whether in a future world, it's as necessary as it was in the past. And some of that earlier discussion about collecting reader information, I think, is very much in that category. I also think we discussed, I think, this being a safe space where we wouldn't fight, if I paraphrase. It distresses me that some of the discourse is always focused on why things won't work. Whereas, in fact, most of the use cases in open access are things that have worked. Now, there's certainly a question of whether they will continue to work and whether they are sustainable, but starting from a position that they won't be, and I think there's some places where that line is taken quite substantially, is, in my view, not a good idea. So working together, trying things out, minimizing the infrastructure as far as we can till we test it is my line. Very specifically, so as a funder, I noticed that along with every other actor in the system, we claim a lot of authority, but we're not always so keen to take on the responsibility. So we do mandate. Some people want us to more strongly mandate because they want us to take the responsibility for decisions, which I think actually funders don't have a mandate themselves to take. equally, of course, university libraries would like us to tell them to do things so that they could pass that responsibility on to us sometimes. Now, I don't say that in any bitter sense, just as a recognition that in the end, we will have to share that responsibility and work together to implement procedures. So Bjorn Brems in his If Funders just said that the money had to be spent or couldn't be spent, I know, because it's my job, that I don't really have the power to do that. And we've got to accept the limitations that are on everyone in the system. What's special about UKRI is that we are a strong supporter of open access where a fee is paid and have been since 2014, I think, roughly very early on following the Finch review, which I was very much involved in stewarding. But we don't pay individual APCs. What we do is pay a block grant to our institutions and then give the institutions the choice of how to use it. That works, for example, for Subscribe to Open, because it validates the model and allows them to choose to use funds on that. But it's not a decision that is taken over everyone's head. Now, does that mean that the funder is paying a fair amount? And we do not allow APCs to be charged to grants because we give a block grant. The sizing of the block grant is therefore important. And we set it at the time that we did as an appropriate percentage of our total research budget, equivalent to what we think the purchasing charges are on the research budget. I'm not sure actually we got that entirely right at the time, and it's certainly not up to date now, which is why we're in the middle of a review to assess it. But it seems to me the principle, first of all, the principle of whether you should hypothecate, given that it's all one big pot. But I think it's useful in this case to give a grant and to hypothecate it, to indicate it's for the use of that. I think sizing it is really important. But I'd put it to you that it does cut out a whole load of unnecessary infrastructure in managing APCs at funder level, which in my view, don't add value to the system. So that's, I think, my introductory comments. Let's cut everyone a bit of slack and let's try different models out and aim for their success while recognizing that indeed they may not fail. Rather than predicting doom at the start, let's look to where we can standardize, but where we may have to forgo as much information as we'd like to begin with. And does it make sense to move away from such detail on APCs, and should we go to a block grant that allows the choice of different models for university libraries and empowers them, but also gives them resources to do it? Thank you.
So wise and well said. So thank you, David. That's quite inspiring. And Lynn, I'm sure you have much to add. Please start.
Thank you so much. So I second David. It's a real pleasure to be here with such a great set of panelists for both panels, and so good to see such a large audience as well. And so I, as a researcher working in computational biochemistry, so I'd like to talk about data sets and the infrastructure for open data sharing. So I've been working with open science for a long time from a researcher perspective, but also policy. And as pretty much everyone present here knows, for a very long time, the focus was on open access, even though open access is just one facet of open science. Now, it's really great to see that in recent years, there's been a much larger move also to focusing on open data and making other parts of the research process open. But the problem with that is the issue of appropriate infrastructure to make it feasible. And so one of the things I've seen in discussions with different stakeholders, data means different things in different fields. And the volume of data means different things in different fields. So for example, in some disciplines, data can be Excel sheets or Word documents or fairly easy to store. And there are already wonderful forums. For example, Zenodo, there's Figshare, Dryad, both commercial and funder supported. And so these are not the data sets where infrastructure is a really major issue. But there are other disciplines such as mine, where when we generate data, we're talking about tens to hundreds of terabytes, sometimes even more. And for example, in high energy physics and in other disciplines where data sharing has been the norm for a long time, there's infrastructure, but there isn't infrastructure for all disciplines. And so for giant data sets, the landscape for infrastructure is much more sparse, especially when there hasn't historically been a culture of open sharing outside networks of collaborations. And also there are other infrastructural challenges. It's not just an issue of where and how to store the data, but also how to access it. So transferring terabytes or petabytes of data, you can't just casually upload or download such large data volumes. And so there are a lot of technical issues about how to make this data open. It also means that researchers, if you do and when you do convince them to share, which obviously I advocate for, you have to make really difficult decisions about what to share when managing really large data sets. And you start asking questions, for example, with simulations, do you want to provide enough to just rerun the simulation, or do you want to actually present end results? And so it's a changing landscape where researchers need to be part of the dialogue. Now, there have been moves to fix this. For example, the European Open Science Cloud is one example, but there needs to be more focus on these issues. I was part of a Chemistry Europe Open Science session just 2 days ago, where there was a question about the role of publishers. And also JACS, the Journal of the American Chemical Society, asked a question about this on their Twitter feed this morning about what the role of publishers is in data sharing. And so I was thinking about this morning, and one of the thoughts that came to mind as a provocative suggestion is on the one hand, publishers could individually, for example, provide infrastructure for sharing data associated with manuscripts, but then you get massive fragmentation issues, and you really want a reliable data storage location where you can put everything together and link to. So the same way that different funders support things like ChemArchive or BioArchive, what about funders, institutions, and also publishers going in on shared infrastructure that's citable with good means to store also large data sets? But this, of course, raises the question of responsibility. So is providing this infrastructure the responsibility of funders, institutions, publishers, national or transnational supercomputing centers? I put a disclaimer that I'm also involved in supercomputer infrastructure, or a combination of all of these. David before me spoke about shared responsibility. And then finally, it's not just an issue of the hardware. So skills training infrastructure is also necessary in order to train researchers in how to properly curate and streamline such huge data sets. Do we need professionally trained staff that manage this infrastructure? And we've talked a lot about clean metadata. So even if it's professionally trained staff, researchers need to be trained to not just do huge data dumps that no one else is going to understand, in order to make these data sets usable by others outside the immediate research team. And so I'd really like to see in coming years streamlined open research flows, which includes data sharing at all steps of the research process. And I think addressing these issues is absolutely essential for widening open data research practices. Thank you.
Great. I am actually curious if we have time. So Lynn, you've talked a lot about terabytes of data and focusing on usability. David, you mentioned block grants for multiple applications of research advancement at the institution level. Do you have a sense of how, broadly speaking, these are allocated and how many might be oriented towards data usability at this scale?
Is this to me or to David?
I was kind of curious how this reached back into what David had said about how institutions are using block grants. But Lynn, if you have some insight into that too, I'd be curious. And Curtis can chime in as well, or anyone else. Yeah.
So in my case, because so I'm based in Sweden, so we don't have a block grant model. One of the things that I'd like to see more centralized infrastructure is also scaling of costs, because when you have large scale infrastructure, because this is the kind of thing that a specialized supercompute facility would be best placed to provide for large data sets. And so you're dealing with multiple aspects. One is the actual hardware and the bandwidth to store and transfer large data sets, but it's also the FTE that's required to actually manage all this infrastructure. And so, of course, if you centralize, you can scale costs very efficiently. And for perspective, in terms of when we talk to different potential providers to store our data, the kind of costs we're looking at is between 50 to 200 euros per terabyte per year. And you can see, especially if you want to store data for 5, 10, even 20 years, and you're accumulating more and more, that really becomes out of control very fast. And so I would say, rather than block grants to institutions because of the scaling issue, I really like, for example, the archive type models with ChemArchive, bioarchive, where specific publishers go in and support. So I would be for pooled infrastructure costs to build large scale infrastructure, where also, because if the publishers go in, you can have streamlined connecting data to papers, the same way that, for example, with ChemArchive and bioarchive, you can link things back to the published document. So, but of course, as with, so FAIR is really important, and citability is really important. So again, Zenodo, for example, allows for DOIs. So there are the pieces together with small scale data sets for things like Zenodo and so on. And so then scaling this up for large data sets, it requires investment and effort, but I think it's very feasible.
Wonderful, terrific. Okay. Curtis, you are next with a third lens.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for the invitation to be here today. So Iowa State University is a public land grant university. And, you know, our institutional mission is to not only create knowledge, but to share it with Iowa and the rest of the world. And so this idea around sharing data, sharing publications, and all the rest, I think it's in Iowa State's DNA. And I think you're seeing that if you were to look at our university, you're seeing it across the operation. I mean, we've got a lot of work to do, but in the area of sharing research data, I think we're very active there. We've launched an open data repository. In the area of open access, Iowa State's a leader with these new open models and experimenting with them. And for my part, I've worked, you know, firsthand directly with all three of the publishers that were just on in the earlier session. So we're extremely committed, we're experimenting, we're collaborating, and I fully agree with what David said about we're at a point of, you know, for me, profound optimism with all of this after working in libraries for, you know, 10 plus years, where our engagement with publishers and to some extent our researchers was extremely limited. You know, we negotiated price and inflation caps and paid bills. And what we're doing now is sitting at the table with publishers, figuring out how we make this open future a reality. So it's quite exciting. So when I think about infrastructure, we're definitely hitting some pain points with things like open access workflows around author verification. I think thinking of infrastructure projects like the OA switchboard, that's something that has tremendous promise that we're a pilot partner on, and we want to see things like that take off. We need to figure out how to make all of this easier to do if libraries are going to be able to scale it. For our part, we have 10 to 12 of these new open access agreements, and I got to tell you, we were working up until earlier this month just to get our 2020 publishing numbers out and reported out across all these different platforms. So lots of room for improvement. And I will just throw out one thing in the area of sharing of research data. A question that we're struggling with is how do we get any visibility whatsoever on where these data sets are being deposited? And so I'm actually on the advisory board for Chorus, and my interest in Chorus is as a kind of mediating platform in order to see things like that. So when we set up a Chorus dashboard, can we track these data sets in such a way that we can actually see for compliance reasons and just for tracking cultural change at the institution? So yeah, lots to talk about here in the area of publications and data.
Super. Yeah, that's incredibly helpful. Thank you so much. And yeah, interesting. I think, you know, within the Chorus frame, we talk a lot. And going back to David's point, it's trying to identify what are the things that everyone needs that will be really impactful to make this work. And it is hard to say, like, how do we prioritize the needs of researchers? Another topic, you know, that's of interest to me is how do the authors themselves fit into this, right? What's our role relative to kind of how they're experiencing things from the ground level, right? So, okay, Catherine Sharples from Wiley is our next presenter.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for the invitation to be part of this panel. I really enjoyed the earlier, the first part of this session, and I've really enjoyed the comments from my fellow panelists in this second part. As we've already touched on, open research is a broad topic, and as a publisher, Wiley comes at that topic from a variety of perspectives, as I know the other panelists do too. Open research or open access to research articles being our primary perspective, but research data is super important, or access to research data is of course also very important. From a publisher perspective, the infrastructure to support open access to research articles is more advanced than that to support open data. So I'm going to concentrate my brief initial comments there, but I know that we'll come to some broader discussion of data in our time together today. So, Wiley have been publishing open access journals for over 10 years, and we've been offering open access in our hybrid journals for much longer. And the most significant progress that we've made towards open access in the past few years have been through the transitional agreements that we've entered into in consortia across Europe, and with institutions like Curtis's own institution at Iowa State. And those are partnerships that we've entered into that are designed, as we heard in the first session, to enable increasing numbers of researchers in those institutions and across those countries to make their research articles openly available without the need to find funds for article publication charges. And as a result of those agreements, we've been very invested in ensuring that the infrastructure that we put in place to support open access makes publishing as easy as possible, both from an author perspective and the management of those agreements as easy as possible from an institutional perspective. The panelists in the earlier session touched on the importance of these issues really nicely. From an author perspective, it's all about ensuring that we have a means to support authors in making publishing choices that are aligned with their funders and their institutional expectations. So making them aware when they're covered by a transitional agreement or by a funder account, and helping them to ensure that they're publishing their work under, for example, the appropriate Creative Commons license in order to comply with any funder mandates in place. It probably sounds like a very obvious thing to say, but our goal is always to make publishing as easy as possible, specifically OA publishing in this case, to see as few authors as possible opt out of open access publishing when they're covered by transitional agreements. And we do still see a small percentage of authors choosing not to take up the OA option, even when they're made aware of the fact that they're covered by these agreements. And from a funder and a library perspective, that means providing the infrastructure to improve article eligibility, to track and to manage their funds and accounts. Again, our goal is to make these agreements, the agreements that we've entered into as easy to manage from a customer perspective as possible. So we've developed our own dashboards for payments and reporting. And, we get really strong feedback on that, but it's always our goal to be as customer centric as possible. So we're excited to see initiatives like OA Switchboard and OAble develop with the goal, again, of making improving the infrastructure and insight into the process. All the panelists, I think, in the first session alluded to the importance of data integrity, of standard author IDs and consistency of institutional ones. And that's really important to making things like transitional agreements work. We found the data lift associated with these agreements to be, I think, substantial is probably how I would describe it. So as more agreements come online, as more libraries and more consortia look to provide financial support for the transition to OA, it's really important to share our experiences in forums like this one, and to look for common approaches and standard ways of doing things, with the goal of best serving the researcher and the library community. So I really echo David's earlier point of working, the importance of trying things out and working together. And I look forward to a good conversation here today.
Great. So I'm going to welcome questions into the chat that we can surface to the panelists and discussion free form between the panelists. I do have one, I was looking at some notes, David, on a few things you'd said. And one of the things that really stood out to me was this focus on the term you used, tractability versus intractability. And that to this question of, how we avoid frustration, increase optimism, and focus on areas of work where there is some tractability versus intractability. And I think that's really, it's a big topic, but that's one of the questions for this panel is where, and Curtis, you said you're really experiencing some collaborative successes. So where would you aim this community, to get these sort of, they're not even, quick wins is not the right term because it's so complex, very infrastructural. But where can we aim together to achieve some of those feelings of success together and high impact?
I think where I was going with those comments is the predilection that some have for producing what they think is a killer argument against some development based essentially on what I would call an edge case. It will arise, but very rarely. Now, if we're going to try to develop a system where all exceptions, as it were, are eliminated, there are no edge cases, then I fear we have an intractable problem, one we cannot just solve. And as a mathematician, the way you deal with insoluble problems is you simplify them, you solve the simple problem, and then you try and generalize it. So you accept that there'll be things that won't work. Now, I think that's very difficult for us because we have passionately held views, for example, about equity, and it's not always clear how we can deliver equity. The current Nature paper talking about, I think, inclusion in OA journals is actually about inclusion on APCs, not on OA. And APCs and OA are not a one-to-one relationship. So I think we do have to try very hard and simplify and accept that things will not be perfect, even some of the things we'd love to see, and store them up as what we've got to do as we generalize the solution to address it. I think there's a whole load of things around where people just say, it can't happen because this won't work. And in fact, it will happen, it will work, and we'll have to pick up the pieces. I take the responsibility to pick up the pieces and address the things that are not right, but not do anything because there will be pieces.
And Alex, if I can add to that, I agree. Just this concept of experimentation and iteration is really where we need to be. And there was a comment I saw recently about questioning whether or not early success, of course, early success doesn't guarantee long-term success, but darn, isn't that a good place to be with early success? That's better than early failure. And to me, that's exciting. And the idea that together we are making decisions and librarians are having knocks on their door and giving options to participate in models that lead to content being open, increasing equity for reading. In many cases, these models increase equity for authors as well. To me, that's a great place for us to be and to learn from. And I don't think anybody wants to spend our next 20 years like we did the previous 20 years, where the data sets were sitting on the hard drives, the publications were sitting behind paywalls, and all of a sudden we have seen just in the last 2 or 3 years, I feel like a real shift in the landscape that is quite exciting. Now, that said, when you have success, it means you need to do things different. And when you need to do things different, that means you need to examine position descriptions, workflows, and all those other things, which is where we're at. And infrastructure, of course, to try and simplify it all.
Lynn, you make a great comment there, and I sort of asked this question earlier, where does the author researcher sit in all of this? We have sort of this ecosystemic vision of how everything could be, vastly improved globally with greater equity and opening up more opportunities for scientific advancement. Researchers are in a highly pressurized and very focused position, trying to do what they are trying to do as part of that ecosystem. So it's quite interesting. Is there this sort of, is it appropriate that we are each taking different lenses, or how do we how do we encourage them to be advocates? Are they able to, given, you know, the great constraints on their own time and focus?
So I think there are two aspects of this. One is our responsibility as researchers, because this how we disseminate knowledge is part of our mandate as researchers. We need to take responsibility for this. But as you pointed out, Alex, I think one thing that gets missed a lot, again, I've been engaged in open science policy as well, and several of my researcher colleagues have. But if you're active, for example, on Twitter or similar, you get this impression that researchers are very engaged. Whereas the reality is that my on-the-ground experience is that most researchers have no clue. They are starting to understand what open access is. Many don't really even know what they know what preprints are, but the bigger implications of different types of licenses, what preprints mean, what it means to actually have shared your data openly, and so on. And part of it is precisely as you pointed, this pressure cooker, because research has become so hyper competitive that everyone is kind of running just to stand still. So people don't have time to then step outside the box. So they're aware of things they're mandated to do. For example, in a funder mandate, if you start getting bombarded with you have to do stuff. And what we want is, we want researchers not just to be aware, but the best way to get researchers to comply is to get them to see why this benefits both them and the broader community. And there are both personal and community level benefits to open science. And I think really those of us who are engaged in open science, if we want to see a transition in the field, we have a lot of responsibility, because we're really great to see there are 112 participants here, but we really need to get researchers to be more aware and come out of their silos. We have to disseminate knowledge, so we can't step back from this discussion.
I completely agree with that, Lynn. I think if you spend a lot of time on Twitter, you can kind of come away with or labor under the impression that researchers' understanding of open access and open research writ large is far greater than it is kind of on the ground. Wiley and other publishers spend a lot of time putting on workshops in collaboration with librarians and with institutions around the world to raise awareness of open access publishing options and to improve understanding of the importance of sharing research articles and sharing data. And quite often what we see in those workshops is a much lower kind of level of understanding from the researcher than we're kind of led to believe if we spend too much time on Twitter. So I think we have a combined educational effort that we need to put more effort into.
So if I could just briefly add to that, one thing that I think is nice at Uppsala is we have this, for incoming master students, we have an introductory course, Actual Trends in Chemistry, where they learn about different things that are hot in chemistry. But the nice thing is that they've let me sneak in lectures on research ethics, plagiarism, etc. And they give them a lecture on open science. Now, I'd rather give them a course on open science than a lecture on open science, but I cover just the basics of why open science is important, how you do it, what to share, what not to share, sensitive data, etc. And I think I'd like to see this in more educational programs, because we focus very much on subject-specific training, but these meta issues are just as important a part of the training, and skills training and awareness should start fairly early in the training process, because these are future researchers, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, I just couldn't agree more. I mean, I think we should, well, in my experience, our libraries are doing a phenomenal job to work with the authors to explain things and to try and shine light. But I do think the broader responsibility of us all to help researchers know just a bit more about the challenges that are in the research system and the significant agency they have in addressing those. It goes beyond libraries. And I'm not just talking here about open access, but the problems we have with the whole research system around culture, diversity, inclusion, indeed even misconduct. I just think we've learned over the last 40 years that I've actually been a researcher or engaged in research that societal attitudes have changed, but the research system is perhaps not quite so quick as it could be in getting to grips with the challenges. And given that our responsibility to society is immense and one that's being discharged, I think, brilliantly, there's still quite a long way to go, I think, for it to be a fully two-way activity.
David, you mentioned something I thought was rather intriguing earlier, which was that the things we focus on now may not continue to resonate in the same way or be as vital in the future. Do you have any sort of examples of, if we follow this trajectory, what might emerge more, what might disappear more?
Well, I think it's difficult to predict, but I mean, privacy is just the simplest one, because when I was at university, actually, we have a census every 10 years in the UK, and there was one when I was at university, and there was a lot of opposition to the census on privacy grounds. After that, there was quite a long period where people were not sensitive to that. I still don't think actually in the UK they're terribly sensitive about the census and privacy, but privacy generally is now a very big issue indeed. So I think that's an example of something where there wasn't a continuous path one way. There's cycles. Privacy is simple. I think there is an argument that libraries become more focused on bluntly the publish element of the job, because access is handled differently. I want to be careful here because I don't want to make huge assumptions around how libraries work with their clients, customers, however you want to refer to. But one of the things I felt when I first had responsibility for University Library in 1997, we had a lot of siloed activity in the library, cataloging, and was a different classification. I mean, it was we had specialists, which was great, but I think largely the time for that passed, and you could buy in services, and libraries changed to being far more researcher focused, at least in what I observed, which I think was a good thing. At the time, of course, the loss of jobs was a dominating conversation, which certainly never happened in my experience. Libraries prospered because they were offering phenomenal services. So I think those are examples. We all take a self-interested point of view of anything, however hard we try not to. And I think we can only overcome that by all of us learning more about the interactions there are in our system.
Yeah, and I think we can make a bit of a conscious effort to check that at the door, noting that it's just a human behavior. But it's interesting with the topic of sort of agility and continuous learning and dropping some of the perfectionist tendencies. The other thing that I'm seeing a lot of is there is an element of really de-siloing as we reinvent how we better serve the community, and we must actually re-envision the roles that we're playing and how we work together. I think that's seems to be true. So those start to pull out some common principles or threads where we can actually be helping one another.
Alex, can I ask Catherine a question?
Please do.
Yeah, just getting back, something that we have noticed at Iowa State is we have entered into agreements with, a range of size and shapes of publishers now, nonprofit, commercial, small to large now. There's the tremendous asymmetry like in the infrastructure itself. So when you're talking to smaller publishers, even mid-sized publishers, it's remarkable to what extent their own infrastructure, their own platforms cannot do the things that they need to do in order to roll out these open models. And a growing concern that I have is with the bigger players, with the deeper investments that can be made in the infrastructure. So, and just as an example of this, like doing all of this work on the Wiley platform is quite amazing. I'm talking about author verification, reporting, the rest. You get on some of these smaller publishers platforms, you know, some of it, again, like we're getting emailed reports, right, that we have to wait, you know, a long time to even get. So the promise of like the OA switchboard is that it could, you know, kind of level the playing field. And I think it's very important that we maintain publisher diversity as we go through this transition. So I'd be interested in your perspective on, you know, how do we kind of lift all of the boats by supporting these community infrastructure projects and ensuring that it's kind of an equitable playing field, even though we are moving toward, I realize, in some way, shape, or form, an article economy that bigger players might be set up to dominate. But I don't think that, my premise is that's not healthy for any of us.
And you're right, Curtis. It's important for the health of our ecosystem to support a variety of players and a variety of models and a variety of, I guess, sizes of entities. As a mixed model publisher, you know, we've had to put in a huge amount of elbow grease and a huge amount of financial investment to make our infrastructure fit for purpose in an open access environment, for an article-based economy. But we absolutely recognize that for some of our partners, there's going to come a point where they don't really want to work with the Wiley open access dashboard and the Springer iteration of that, or the ACS iteration of that, and whoever else, and have a completely separate interface for PLOS and other publishers. So entities like the OA switchboard and other similar functions, I think, are important for the big players to support. And you know, we've had lots of really productive conversations with Yvonne at the OA switchboard and have provided, you know, some early support to that particular initiative, and will continue, you know, see ourselves continuing to do so in future, probably not just with OA switchboard, but with other entities too, because as I mentioned earlier, it's our goal as publishers, and I think it should be the goal for all publishers, to kind of meet their community, meet their customer where they are, rather than trying to force them down one particular workflow or one particular road, because it's the one that you have the most investment in.
Do we have, you know, again, kind of thinking about simplicity? I mean, it's interesting. We want simplicity. We don't want to reduplicate efforts in a million different directions. At the same time, I think we want, you know, new sort of startup initiatives and new things coming into the system all the time. You know, just trying to think about whether we have a common visualization or understanding of everything that's happening out there, right? How do we balance those two things of enabling innovation, but not being too splintered?
I mean, I think the OA switchboard is a good test case. I remember going along to the very first introductory meeting, and I haven't had anything significant to do with it. So I thought at the time it was a wonderful idea that would be too complicated to deliver. Now they've demonstrated that was not true. I think there could be a little bit of work to identify what the success factors were. And I mean, I think actually it's only success so far, but it's nevertheless quite a significant piece of work. It has got a very strong cross-community engagement, but I'm just not close enough to know why it has worked, whereas other things haven't worked. I do think wearing my occasional Coalition S hat, I think Coalition S should not be about designing the details of infrastructure. I think it's about providing impetus for multiple routes to open access. But we have done some stuff where I'm slipping into Coalition S territory, I should be clear. So I think with the cost transparency, clearly lots and lots of people want it, but addressing what people collectively want, and of course also what the publishers are able, I think I've got to say, and willing to do with all sorts of comments about competition law thrown in, is difficult. This is an area which I think needs taken forward, and the coalitionist work is stimulating that, but should not be the definitive ownership eventually.
Really useful to hear. So we are drawing close to our close time, but I want to, any burning questions, please put in Q&A or chat, or any sort of summarizing thoughts or takeaways, how you'd like us to focus our attention before we disband.
I guess, Alex, I have a quick question for Lynn, who talked very eloquently in her introduction about open data and data sharing, and also referenced this recent conversation about the role that publishers should or shouldn't have in enabling data sharing. And I just wondered what Lynn's perspective on the publisher role in that space was.
But the one apology is, as you see, I have an active baby now in this
Sorry.
series. But so I can give a personal story. So coming from a computational background, historically, one of the biggest criticisms of my discipline has been that we don't give enough data for reproducibility. And of course, this then experimentalists complain that it's a lot because they say we can get any number we want. And especially the ACS Journal of Organic Chemistry, because organic chemistry is a particular discipline where experimentalists have been skeptical of theoreticians. In the mid-2000s, they started putting a very, very high bar, not just for experimental compound characterization and so on, but also for computational work in terms of the data you have to provide. Now, without infrastructure, this has led to sort of 100, 200-page supporting information documents. They really need a better way to manage it. But basically, this push from publishers and journals to push for data sharing really improved transparency and the reproducibility in computational chemistry, and the landscape is very different now. And so, I mean, we've talked about hyper-competition and publish or perish. So one way to mobilize researchers, we want to publish, and there are certain journals we want to publish in, and if we're mandated to share data to publish in those journals, it's the fastest way to get us to do it. So as long as the infrastructure is also provided, I think publishers play a really central role in providing the carrots to get researchers to share data.
Good. I do appreciate that question because, as part of this, how do we collaborate? One of the key questions is, I do like this idea of where can we really seamlessly band together and sort of unify towards shared causes for sure. Okay, others, before we wrap up, final thoughts? David, Curtis, Howard?
I'll just throw out one other quick point. I think a challenge for libraries that are looking to, shift this traditional collection spend from supporting, closed access to investing in open access. It's not just about these open models, it's also about the open infrastructure. And that just raises a lot of questions for libraries who are not always in the best position to gauge where that investment, should really happen. And so there's work going on with like the Invest in Open Infrastructure project with Caitlin Thaney. But that's something I would really like to see in this open infrastructure space to support all these things we've talked about today. Guidance to libraries on where we should be making these investments. I think it's really needed.
Excellent point. Yeah, we haven't talked about technology investments or vendors or other kinds of things quite in that realm. And David, did you have any?
I think I'd close by saying I think we need to look a little bit at what the South Americans have done in building a diamond infrastructure. I think we've got to think more about how that might or might not work in different contexts here, particularly in Europe, I think, where the Commission have got a platform approach, which is a different kind of diamond, and whether that's something to build on. I think the biggest challenge, I can't resist leaving without saying something slightly controversial, the biggest challenge is the US, where there's moderately passionate support for very different models. And that seems to me quite different from virtually every other country, where they're coalescing on the whole in an approach. Even if you look at China and India, in addition to South America, where it's sort of continent, Europe, there's a fairly common approach. Canada too is, I think, going down on a fairly national approach. But at the heart, there's very, very challenging situation in the States with different approaches, and not yet the engagement, in my view, between funders and university libraries, which has been tremendously beneficial in virtually every other country I've mentioned. Now, it might be the US is just big and different, and that's life. I accept that. But I think quite a lot could happen in the US that hasn't happened yet for probably quite obvious reasons.
Super. I love closing with a little controversy because it'll lead into whatever our next engagement is. Well, thank you so much. Fabulous, fascinating, insightful panelists, all of you. And Howard, I will hand it to you to wrap us up.
That was a great session. It's been a really great day. Hopefully everyone that is on either a panel or attended has really gotten a lot out of today. I know I certainly have. Again, a very special thank you to our sponsors, ACS, AIP, Wiley, AMS, Silverchair, and STM. And if you could, fill out our poll. Tara's going to put it in the chat. So it does help us to plan for future events. It also helps Chorus plan on what it wants to do next. I walked away with a lot of ideas. I'm sure Alex did too, out of today's discussion. And this is not the end of discussions, but it just continues to be the beginnings of it. So there'll be a lot more coming from Chorus in the way of forums. And once again, thank you. And we'll be providing a summary of this, as well as we will also be providing the full video next week. And we've had a request to include the chat. So we will certainly do that, and also the results of all the interactive things that we were doing with you today. And so it was a really great day, and I appreciate it. Have a wonderful weekend, and thanks.